Hello and welcome, dear friends, in this 16th year of the Turner Winter Series. I'm Maureen Raveno, proud and grateful to serve as Director for Religion at Chautauqua Institution, and grateful to have been associated with the Turner Winter Series these many years. We come to you for today's presentation, traditionally held at Chautauqua, with great appreciation to be here in the socially distancing capacity of the Kappa Theater in the Robert H. Jackson Center this year, virtually, in a format to which we have all become accustomed in this time of COVID. It is my great pleasure to begin today's conversation with a brief introduction of our guest, Ned Ward, after which I will turn the conversation over to our perennial host and the founder of this series, Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. Today's conversation will focus on Ned's latest book, The Last Raft, Timbering Chautauqua's Virgin Watershed, but you know that Greg will broaden the conversation in delightful and unexpected ways. So, let me first tell you a little something about Ned Ward. Fletcher Ward, known as Ned, is a lifelong resident of Weymouth Pine on Chautauqua Lake. Following a career as Environment, Health, and Safety Manager with the American Locker Group and Signor Incorporated in Jamestown and Ellicottville, New York, he worked as project manager for building controls and services in Falconer, New York, until his retirement. Ned is a member and co-president of the Weymouth Pine Historical Society, as well as a member of the Fenton Historical Society, the Chautauqua County Historical Society, and the Lawson Boat Heritage Museum in Weymouth Pine. Since retirement, Ned has invested much of his time as a volunteer for the local historical organizations, as well as in writing books on the history of the Chautauqua Lake region. His works also include Saving Chautauqua's Muskies, Chautauqua Lake's Great Race, the history of Chautauqua Lake's ice industry, and the history of Chris Craft Corporation's Jamestown division, the latter book serving as a fundraiser for the Lawson Boating Heritage Museum. Ned's hope is that the books that he has published have preserved portions of the rich history of the Chautauqua Lake region, and that they have contributed to his readers falling in love with Chautauqua Lake as much as he has. Ned himself is a Chautauqua treasure, as is Greg, and so it is now my great pleasure to welcome Ned Ward and Greg Peterson.
Okay. Ned Ward, thank you very much for coming back again. You've done this a couple times and you still keep saying yes.
Well, it's a pleasure.
So we have this book that we're going to talk about today entitled The Last Raft, Timbering in Chautauqua's Virgin Watershed. The term last raft. As you were writing this, could you envision yourself on that last raft as it was being launched from someplace on Chautauqua Lake, moving itself down the Chautauqua and then into the Cassadaga Creek and so on? Could you envision that?
Well, I could, Greg, and I'll tell you, it is now a true pleasure to travel down the outlet. If you haven't done it, it is just great. It's been cleaned up, it's been dredged. To travel down there and see the wildlife and the waterfowl is just absolutely amazing. It's like you were in a different country.
You come by this whole interest in Chautauqua Lake naturally. So tell me about your great-grandfather.
Well, my great-grandfather was an inventor. He invented the folding card table and the box spring mattress and I don't know, half a dozen other things that were common in the day. Started a business with his brother, the Chautauqua Spring and Mattress Company, up as you go around the curve in Mayville, and was a steamboat pilot, one of the steamers, and we still have his license. So
Now, your families, what attracted them to Chautauqua County? What's that introduction?
You know, I can't tell you, as much as I love history, I don't get into genealogy at all. My sister-in-law is forever sending articles and information to us on the family, on where they came from and what they did and that. And for whatever reason, I have no interest in it. It's a strange thing for somebody that loves history.
Yeah, so now, if I brought in Henry Gates right now to do your life story, you probably would be yawning.
That's right.
Nice, nice. So, why this tremendous interest in Chautauqua Lake? Did you grow up right on the lake itself? Is that part of you?
I grew up in Bemis. My grandfather, well, his wife's parents had what is now the Fish in Bemis. It was an ice cream parlor during the summer primarily, but they also sold newspapers of the day and cigars. And that was really all they peddled. And he made a very good living at it. He would watch for the steamboats to come, and when they unloaded their passengers, they made a lot of money.
Where did they disembark in Bemis Point? I'm trying to visualize that. Where's the location there?
As you face the Fish, on the left-hand side, there was a pathway that went down to the steamboat dock. And that's where they came and went.
Do you have visions of the steamer? I have a vague image, and I think we're probably this close to the same age, of the city of Jamestown kind of doing up and down. Do you remember that?
I absolutely do. My brother and I were coming back from the beach, which was at the time down by the casino, to the left of the casino, or south side. And we were just up above the Hotel Lenhart, and we heard the steamboat blow for the ferry, which was a requirement to make sure the ferry was on one side or the other so that the props didn't hit the steamboat cables. And we turned around, and there was a huge pall of absolutely black smoke far above the maple trees. It was a vision that's up here as clear as it was yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah, and I similarly, when you are in Bemis Point and you go to the casino and you look off to the around there, did you ever find any arrowheads? Because that was a kind of an Indian's grave.
Absolutely. Arrowheads and net sinks. I never found any. I found a tomahawk down there, a very nice tomahawk. But this past spring, I was fortunate enough to find a greenstone celt, which Jack Erickson confided was probably traded here in the 1750s.
Really?
So just a beautiful little 4.5-inch long small celt.
In your book, which I commend to anybody who's watching this, because of the content well and above what is in the title. The title, you're thinking about rafting, you're thinking about lumbering, all of which are critical pieces, but you've added so much more of the history of Chautauqua County, including we were segueing ourselves into the indigenous people, the Indians, and kind of the area where if they would have been about settling in Chautauqua County. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there were several encampments. One was right down by the what's now the park in Bemis Point. There was one up near the Methodist Church at Bemis Point, and then there were encampments down on Town Line Road and down near Coal Springs Creek. But you can, and on Tom's Point, or White's Point as it was called then, you can find arrowheads pretty much anywhere around the county. There was They're not as concentrated as they are in the encampment areas, but if you're fortunate, you can find them.
Well, if you're a developer and you're not so fortunate, you hope you don't find them.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Sorry, folks. So that when we talk about the area of your interest, Chautauqua Lake, we can't help but try to understand the Chautauqua Lake watershed. And it's significant as far as just acreage and kind of its geography. And I know you don't have the book in front of you, but I'm asking you, could you roughly describe when we talk about the Chautauqua Lake watershed, what really that is?
Okay, it's an area of about 13,000 acres in the Chautauqua Lake portion, which is about equally divided between the upper and lower lake, I think 48 and 52% roughly. But there's about 75,000 acres in tributary streams, the largest being Prendergast Creek. And there's, I think, if I remember right, there were 14 named tributaries and 4 unnamed tributaries that feed the lake.
Wow. I mean, you provide such vast information here, and even as you leaf through this. As you talk about the watershed, and obviously part and parcel of that is the conservancy and watershed interest that several people, in fact, behind me, out of camera view are some folks who are part of the Chautauqua Lake Alliance who are very, very interested. They have been very interested because they read this in advance of
Okay.
today. So you're a source of knowledge, continue to be.
Well, I hope I always can be.
And as part of that, of course, is the encouragement of a population to come here. Can you speak a little bit about some of the people who actually came through here and maybe some of the early settlers?
Well, virtually all the European countries, or several of them anyway, came through here. The French certainly came through. The Dutch and the English were the primary ones. And the French came over through what we now say is the Portage Road from Lake Erie over to the area around Mayville. Not sure exactly where they came in, but they left leaden tablets along the way on their journey, supposedly commemorating their
Were those lead plates, were they designed to lay claim? Or was it something just sort of dropping souvenirs, or?
I think a little of both.
Yeah.
I think they wanted people to know that they had established claim to that area, but also to, like anyone, just say, I was here. And I think one has been found that I'm aware of.
Really?
Not recently.
Yeah, yeah.
But there are still supposedly several others that have yet to be found.
So those can go in search of, my golly. So we have the early, the French came through, Celeron, as you mentioned in the book, and others. But then at some point, what was the draw to somebody kind of building a settlement here? What is it that, and you hear the names, the Prendergasts and others who decided to come to this area, what was the draw?
Well, the original draw was because the European countries had virtually decimated their force. There was very little left of them, especially the English, and the English had enormous fleets of ships, and all of them were sailing ships and required very large masts. They were targets of anyone with whom they were fighting. They would try and annihilate the mast, and that disabled the boats and crippled them, and they were easy targets from that point on. There were no more masts to be had in England, and they decided to come here and try and utilize the resources that were here in the New World, but primarily what they called the mast pines. They were light and large and straight and virtually limbless, so they had great strength. And the English would come over, and Queen Elizabeth had her people come through, survey the area, and mark with 3 strikes of an axe, the English broad axe, would mark a tree as belonging to the crown. It didn't matter if it was on Greg Peterson's property or not. If it was over 24 inches, it belonged to them. And you better not be figuring on cutting that pine tree down.
So, was that a blaze? Is that what,
It was a blaze. That was a blaze. Normally, a real blaze is just taking off a piece of a tree bark to expose the inner bark as being a sight line. But this was a very definite 3 strikes of the axe to make an arrow-shaped mark on the tree.
Wow. Ownership is an interesting part. You cover that in your book of just the land and how it went back and forth, sales and all, Robert Morris in Massachusetts. But ultimately, we most recently remember the Holland Land Company.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how maybe that got formed and what impact that had for our area?
Well, the Holland Land Company was a consortium of Dutch bankers, a syndicate of sorts, that purchased the land for really very little. If I remember right, it was mere pennies an acre, and they purchased virtually everything from Seneca Lake west. So it was quite a piece of land, and the intent was to develop it. So they chose Mr. Ellicott to come and survey it, and he spent about 2 years surveying the entire western portion of the state, and a very accurate survey, both in terms of the dimensions, but also in terms of what it contained. There's notes that are available that you can get that would tell you the actual species of trees that were found at a particular point in Chautauqua County at that time. The types of birds and the types of animals, things like that. So it was an extremely accurate survey. It was one of the first to be done with a standardized chain of 16.5 feet that was measured each night for accuracy, and actually became the standard of township and range that we still use today for property identification.
So they referred to some of those standardization as the standardized surveyor's 2 perch chains.
And I don't know what perch, fish, or just what that means.
Yeah, at 16.5 feet for those interested. And they would plot it out, and they had something called certain trees, marker trees, and, you know, sort of at points. And what were they called? I forget that. I was quickly looking for it. But anyways, they would use the actual forest itself. They blaze it. Oh, witness trees. Witness trees. And that was sacred stuff.
It was. Foresters would not cut witness trees because they had such importance to defining who owned what in the community.
By the way, for those that are curious, this is a more of a Tom Price type clearing title thing, that the Holland Land Company had to cut a deal to clear title.
Yep.
You know, clearing title with the Senecas. And so it's a fascinating, I don't know where you found this is great. The Senecas' ancestral claims had to be dealt with. So Robert Morris and his associates met with the Iroquois leaders Black Snake, Red Jacket, Corn Planter, and other sachems at what came to be known as the Treaty of Big Tree in 1797. In return for the title to the land, a quiet title action, love it, the Seneca retained about 200,000 acres on 3 reservations, which is today. In addition, they were also granted $100,000 in cash and 60 cows.
60 cows.
And to sweeten the deal, this is great, the negotiating chiefs, so that now they're dealing with the chiefs specifically, each received annuities ranging from $50 to $600, so that you're cutting a deal not only with the nation,
Yep.
but you're also cutting a deal with, hey, if you guys do this, we're going to give you some Social Security payments. It's a great deal. So now they cut the deal, they own the land, Joseph Ellicott is out there surveying it, and there are notes relating to the forest, and do you get a sense of what the composition was, that the notes tell us that back in, this is 1800s,
Yep.
early 1800s, kind of what our forests look like around here?
It was a beech, maple, ash, oak, and pine. Pine was the most desirable, comprised about 11%, if I recall, of the total forest population.
This is white pine?
White pine, or Weymouth pine, it was also known as. It was especially valuable because it was easily worked. The tools of the day were fairly crude. You made them yourself, you sharpened them yourself, and so they had to be very efficient, and they did not work especially well on hardwoods. So the pine was the timber of choice for building your home, for any kind of lumber that you needed, and also for ship's masts or anything like that. Besides that, it floated. All the hardwood species were fairly dense and would sink if you put them in water. So that became a driving force later in the book.
By the way, just a little news note, and your book is loaded with them, but I like this. The largest remaining white pine is believed to be located in Warren County in the New York State DEC's Region 5. It is listed as the state's big tree register as being 169 inches in circumference at 4.5 feet above ground level and a height of 152 feet. So, for our good friends of Four Connor in the audience there, don't cut that one down, okay?
No.
Okay, try not to. So, they identified this forest, and at some point an industry is created because of the demand. So, they got the forest, and then so all of a sudden there are interested folks who want to live here, especially in Jamestown we're aware of locally, and James Prendergast, and all of a sudden they want to build a house, and by building a house you need a sawmill, and of course you have access to water. How did that all kind of evolve?
Well, it wasn't just building a house, it was the shingles for the house. It was tannin bark from the hemlock trees to tan your hides of your animals that you wanted to preserve. It was all the hardwood species which you couldn't work easily, so they were ultimately burned for ash. And the ash industry became an enormous industry here in Chautauqua County. First going north to Montreal, and a gentleman by the name of Walter Smith, I believe it was, that was kind of the king of the asheries in the county. And you have to think of the time frame, but in 1 year, he made $75,000 selling ash. So that, I don't know comparable today what that would be, but it would be a lot of money.
Yeah.
But you're right, the people needed wood to build their homes, and pine being the choice, they were able to utilize the water flow in the Chautauqua with a what they call a flutter wheel power source. They would mount a wheel on a shaft so that the bottom of the wheel would contact the water and drive the wheel around. And that would convert it to a reciprocating or up and down motion in a saw. And most of the early wheels were driven this way, especially on the river, which was a slow-moving but very predictable source of power. Where you had more of a drop in elevation, you could use other types of wheels, and they were far more effective and efficient.
So the initial use, of course, is domestic in the sense it's local.
Yep.
And could you kind of walk me through what the process is? They identify a stand of white pine, and they say, all right, we're going to cut it down. Somehow we're going to get it to a sawmill so it can be prepared to make my house.
Yep.
How does that all work?
Well, they early on, it was all done by axes, and one of the most renowned axe companies in the United States was down here just off Faulkner Street, on the Jeffords Axe Company. And they produced a number of varieties of axes. Most of the early wood was split, wasn't sawed until they started using water power, or one man would stand on a cribbing with a log, and then there would be a pit below the log, and there would be a man standing on that, and he would be following a line that they struck on the log. The man on the bottom would be pulling down on the log. The more skilled individual would be the top sawyer. He would be on top, and the guy on the bottom just showered himself with sawdust. So that was the earliest of the sawing operations. When they were able to convert water power to reciprocal power, they began using reciprocating blades with very large teeth that would go up and down and cut a board, and they'd have to run the board through multiple times to get it all sawn. And later times they used what they called gang saws, which would actually cut. They were spaced whatever dimension you wanted the finished piece of wood to be, and there might be 12 or 14 gangs in a saw, so they would cut all the lumber with one pass. And Prendergast Mill was that way, and it ran 24/7, and virtually all of the outfall from it went in the Chautauqua. And that was the way with most mills. Any slabs, because people didn't want to buy Wayne, which is the outer circumference board. They didn't want to buy that, so they'd throw that in the river, and all the sawdust went in the river. It was really a sad commentary, but it was the way they did business at the time.
In order to get it to a sawmill, you cut it up in Greenhurst, or you cut it up where we now know it. How did they get it there? I assume how did they take advantage of the lake?
Well, they would do it one of two ways. They would either cut in the winter in teams, and they would actually ice down runways through the woods and run their sleds that they would pile the logs on that iced down snow. Or they would take it to the mill, and the mill was typically located on a stream. They would cut it at the mill and then pile it next to the stream. And this was, I found to be true throughout the watershed. Even on small streams, they would make a pile of lumber that was cut 16 feet long, and they would have 3 skids that they would pile that on, and then they would pile a row of wood planks on that, and then a row 90 degrees to that, and build what they called a piece, and put on each of the 4 corners, they would put wooden pegs that were about 2 inches in diameter that they grubbed from the ground. And by grubbing, I mean they would dig up a sapling and cut all the roots away to form a ball and put that up through the holes in the 4 corners. And then when they got all the planks built in rows, 16 by 16, they'd put a cap piece on it and wedge it in place. Then they'd wait for the spring thaw. And when they got a sufficient flow, they would work it down the stream. Or they would build a dam they call a splash dam, and they would get the piece built and then allow it to flood and raise the piece so it floated, and then cut the dam loose and everything would go downstream.
So the mills, that's a way to get it to the local mills, but all of a sudden the demand starts increasing. There's a market beyond just regionally, and that meant somehow to get this timber from Chautauqua Lake and the Chautauqua Lake watershed down the river. How did it work?
Well, people have told me, and I think it is true today, that the Warner Dam doesn't control the depth of the lake. It kind of fine tunes it. It's the shale outcropping down here that is virtually the dam for the lake. But in those times, they would float these rafts 16 by 16 and might be as many as 32 courses of inch-thick boards down the river in the spring or during the thunderstorm period. So it might have been that the lake was a little less shallow at the time. I don't know. But they definitely took these down. They would take them down to Levant, where they would begin ganging them together with coupling pieces, and then they would start off down the river. There'd be a steersman in the front and in the back and a pilot. The steersman would have a sapling, when I say a sapling, a tree probably 8-inch diameter, maybe 25 feet long, the end of which had a board on it that was attached to it, and it was in a yoke on the front and the back of the piece, and the steersman would manipulate that back and forth to not propel the piece, but direct it in the current. And they would go down to Levant, couple these. When they got to Warren, they might couple 3 long, 2 wide platforms to being 2 of those across and maybe 3 or 4 long. They'd do that again when they got to Pittsburgh, if they didn't sell the lumber in Pittsburgh, to the point where on the Ohio, they might have a raft that was over 500 feet long. So it was a lot of timber leaving Chautauqua County, and for many years, Chautauqua County and northwestern Pennsylvania was the hub of the lumber industry in the United States.
It's hard to imagine today going down the Chautauqua, and you get to Warner Dam, and then obviously assume they get up, they get around that, and it just continue on. The serpentine approach that the Chautauqua is till it finally gets to the confluence of the Cassadaga Creek. Obviously, that wasn't there then, because there's no way, you can't even get a kayak through there.
Well, my own mind tells me that before the timbering of our watershed, the water probably flowed year-round in much greater quantities. And we didn't have the evapotranspiration that takes place now on a lot of small streams. But they would primarily raft in the early spring to take advantage of the snow melt from the winter. In fact, one of the first legislative acts of the Chautauqua County Legislature was to move the date of voting back so that pilots and rafters could make their runs and get back in time to cast their ballots.
So this is so fascinating. You literally put together your raft system down at Levant. I mean, that's where you kind of pull it all together. And what would normally be a raft size? How many people would be on a raft? What would it be, what consist of?
Well, a string would be typically 3 pieces long, so it would be 48 feet long by 16 feet wide. And that would go down through the Chautauqua. It would start to be multiplied down in Levant, and again further down as they got to larger waters down in Warren. But it wouldn't just be lumber on these rafts. When you couldn't get to the woods, you had to have something to do to create a living, so you would split shingles. You cut the logs into bolts and rive them into shingles and shape them and put them in piles and bundle them, put those on top of the raft. That would go down the stream. If you raised chickens, they might go down. Virtually any product that you could be associated with would go down the stream as cargo on these rafts and would be sold when you got to the destination. Or when the lumber was sold, you kind of had to sell it all.
Well, was it a passenger service at all?
There were people that traveled on it just for the experience. It wasn't, pay me so much money and I'll take you down the river. But there were people that was a way of getting around the country or an adventure for them.
So I'm visualizing somebody like Ned Ward, Greg Peterson. We get co-opted to be a raftsman. I'm sure there's a specific term for it. We're down there and we work our way to the Allegheny, and we work our way, all of a sudden we're in Pittsburgh. And all of a sudden we have this lumber. We got somebody we got to deal with here because we were selling it.
Yep.
And I assume, how do they get paid?
They would be paid, and there was 2 thought processes. One would be that you would go as far as Pittsburgh and sell, because then you could get back to Chautauqua County, get another raft, and maybe make 2 trips or possibly 3, or you might take the lumber down to Cincinnati, which was the jumping off spot for western travel, and out in the plains, they didn't have a lot of lumber, so a lot of those pioneers took some measure of lumber with them, so it was sold in Cincinnati. But by far the most went on down to New Orleans, which was the second largest export terminal in the United States, and demanded the highest price.
So in one sense, the guy who's the captain, who's controlling the deal, he controls the lumber, is going from location to location. What do you give me? Not good enough, I keep going.
Keep going.
Another way. And at some point, they sell. And if you're in Pittsburgh, that means you can't just get on a boat and come back. How do you get back?
Well, that's the part that actually got me interested in this, because I found in a history book the kind of a short biography of a gentleman from Ellery Center. His name was Harrison Pearson. And Harrison was a Raft pilot. And he was known to have walked back on several occasions from New Orleans. When you think about it, there were still Indians that were hostile at the time. There were black bears, panthers, rattlesnakes, no roads, very few paths. So these guys were real pioneers. Harrison Pearson was in Wellerville, Ohio, which is about 180 miles from here, with a load of lumber, sold it, and walked home in 3 days.
Wow.
That's 60 miles a day through the woods. Now, he was 6'6", a big man, but still, that tells you the dedication of these men to making a living.
What were the dangers? I mean, you got water, unpredictability. You don't know when somebody may have dumped a load that just, you know, you were talking about the buoyancy and the density of some lumber that, you know, all of a sudden it breaks up and that logs hit, you know, they go to the bottom.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how they kind of navigated around there, or even had any ideas?
Well, this wasn't a one-time event. These guys went year after year after year, so they began to know the eddies that you could tuck into for the night. They didn't run the Conewango at night. They didn't run the Chautauqua at night. Very few of them ran the upper reaches of the Allegheny. If they did, and they had to run at night, they would throw potatoes. And if they could hear the potato splash, they were still safe. If they heard it hit the ground, they were too close to shore. But they would navigate really by memory, or they had two different texts that they used, the Allegheny Raft pilot and another one, I don't remember the name, that had very, very specific maps in them that showed them all the riffles and the eddies and the rapids and any bridges, which were very deleterious. Many of the bridges, even here in town, were taken out by rafts in the spring.
It's lots of danger. And I know that in your book you talk about often farmers would have dams.
Yep.
And you'd have to, you visualize there's a raft coming down the Conewango or wherever, and all of a sudden they got to navigate in and around a dam. They can't just portage, they got to deal with it. How do they deal with it?
The early dams went clear across the river. It didn't take them long to figure out that they needed to have ways to get the lumber rafts and other boats and that around the dam, and they began to have places like a lock that you could go through on the side of the dam to get around it. But dams took their tolls on the boats.
I
And-
noticed
and-
and you talk a lot, I mean, there are some stories about trying to navigate over the dams.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And,
The, when you took on a raft, you didn't get paid until you got the raft to the point where you sold it. So if the raft got dashed to pieces on a dam or on a bridge, you went downstream and collected all the debris and put your raft back together before you could go downstream any further.
tell me what the law is for broken up rafts, and when timber's floating along, how does that work?
That was a freebie. You know, the pirating rafts was not uncommon. If your raft got broken up and you didn't collect all the debris and put it back together, anybody could come along and collect all that material and call it their own.
Love it. We've been talking about the lumber industry and, but the byproducts we talked about, and we live in Jamestown, New York, which is known as the Pearl City. And it's not what you think, folks, the name, it comes from a different source.
Yeah, Norm Carlson turned me on to that. I always thought Pearl City was pearl ashes, but the real pearl ash industry was in the north end of the county and in Asheville, and
Hence the name.
hence the name. There were 4 asheries in Asheville. They would cut any hardwood tree and take the limbs and everything, put them in a heap, and then they would call their neighbors with their teams and pull the logs up onto the heaps and burn them. And they would burn them to ash. And then they would very carefully go through and sweep up all the ash and take it to an ashery, and you could trade ash for products, or you could sell ash. And ash was the only product at the time which you could sell for cash. Most everything else was a barter. So at the ashery, they would put that ash into big vats and burn it. And they would either burn it part way and then mix it with water to form they called it black salts. It was a gooey, sticky mess. Or they would burn it in an oven until it became pearly white, and they called them pearl ashes. And because they were more concentrated, they were worth a lot more money.
Production of hardwood ash, potash, pearl ash, and black salts to make money led to the knowledge that Chautauqua County was the largest producer of potash from 1810 until 1830.
Big industry.
Big industry. And what was it used for? What was the end use for the potash?
Well, some of it actually was used as a substitute for baking powder in making bread. Some was used, was sent north to Montreal, and some of it overseas, where it was used in the making of glass there or in Pittsburgh. It was also a component of glass. But it was used in fertilizers and a number of different things.
In your chapter concerning the potash industry, you conclude by saying, clearing land for farming and for the production of ash, potash, pearl ash was one of, and likely the most, environmentally destructive of all forest-related activities of our area. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, if you think about ash, when they would make ash into potash, they had a big vat, and they would put the ash in, and then they would pour water over it. And all that water had to go somewhere, and it was essentially lye. And it would just go down the stream and taint the lake. So it had a huge effect on the lake. Besides that, I think it was Edson, in one of his notes, talked about looking around the entire horizon, 360 degrees, and all he could see was black smoke billowing up from the trees being burned. That's pretty devastating for our forests.
Your book talks about the rafting and timbering, and we've been focusing a lot on Chautauqua Lake, which is hence our focus. But in Chautauqua County, there is also Lake Erie, and probably that was also a trail, if you will. Timbering found its way to Lake Erie, then
Yep.
that goes in a different direction.
When you drive between Mayville and Westfield, about a mile out of town in Mayville, you'll see a sign, Chautauqua Lake Watershed. From there northwest, water flows over to Lake Erie. And the forest products were taken from that area primarily on Lake Erie, and the lumber was taken to North Tonawanda, which became known as the Lumber City. It was a huge area of milling up there.
So help me out though, that a lake, unlike a river flows, you know the direction you're going in. At that time, how did those rafts, find their way to, was it just rowing, or was it just?
I have to believe it would have been sail power at that time. I know Christy Herbst did a great presentation on the early fishermen, and they used a lot of sail power to go out into the lake and fish. So I presume that would have been the same.
Help me out, I've driven out of Mayville heading towards Westfield, and I know there is a road which John Lunsman describes in a wonderful video outside, maybe Parker Road, I'm not sure, where if the water goes on one side of that road, it ends up, in the Mississippi, and if another one ends up in the Atlantic. What's the road? Help me out.
I can't recall, to be honest with you.
All right, folks, all you listeners, I have sent to all of you a few years ago the John Lunsman tapes. They were being shown. They're on YouTube. Find it. There is the road. Much wealth was created with all that timbering during the early 1800s, really kind of a heyday from 1810 to kind of 1850. Many of the names that we hold in iconic stature, the Prendergasts, the Fentons, the Frews, that's all money much money that was created through the lumber industry. And we are the beneficiaries. Often many of the cities are named after those entrepreneurs.
Yep.
Yet with that came its sort of destruction and impact on our environment today. Do you want to kind of talk about that?
Well, you're right in what you say. These people really, I don't think, considered the consequences of what they were doing. I think they looked on themselves as being kind of beneficent in terms of making employment for people, and certainly donating much of their wealth along the way. So I don't think the idea of the environment was firmly implanted at that point.
Well, I think there's unintended consequences
Yes.
here. Yeah. I don't mean to say just that there were like robber barons or anything like that. It's just the process here. And we're kind of living with that.
Yep. Well, certainly, all one has to do is drive down 3rd Street and go past Farm Fresh and see the destruction of those beautiful red oaks that we lost this winter. And you can appreciate what it must have been like for hundreds of acres of trees of that size. And then they were gone.
It's a really good example because I've lived here all my life, but now when you do go across 3rd Street Bridge and you hit that Lynn's Funeral Home heading towards Lake, it's remarkable what a difference that not having that canopies and stuff like that. As you wrote the book, could you envision yourself being a rafter?
I would love to have been a rafter. I really would. I love people. These guys would put up for the night where they were unsure of the water conditions. And there was cited a couple examples in there of being able to physically walk from one raft to another in the eddies down around Warren for 9 miles without getting your feet wet. That's how many rafts were in there. And can you imagine just sitting down with some of those guys and talking about the experiences they had had rafting, with hitting bridges or having their raft getting caught up in a water situation where they were actually thrown off the raft or the raft was broken apart. I mean, just tremendous experiences to talk about.
You knew you were coming here today. You've done this before, and I know that Maureen set us up saying that this interview would have some delightful and unexpected ways. And is there something tonight that you were anticipating me asking you that I haven't?
Wow. You always shot right from the hip, anything you wanted to know, so I wouldn't be surprised with anything.
You conclude your book, I should say now, that conclude the actual about yourself. I pray to God every night of my life to be given the strength and power to continue my efforts to inspire in others the interest, the obligation, and the responsibilities that we owe to this land for the sake of future generations, for my boys and girls, so that we can always look back when the candle of life burns low and say, thank God I have contributed my best to the land that contributed so much to me. That was a quote from Eddie Rickenbacker, but you adopted that. Can you kind of elaborate on your sense of what these books, this history, this collection, I mean, you now have a body of work here, means to?
Well, we're losing a lot of history for a lot of reasons. And I've been fortunate enough to live a good part of that history and to know people who lived it before me, in whom I had a lot of interest and learned a lot. And I feel badly for our children because they won't have those experiences. And I hope that through writing, I can pass on a few of those to them.
You dedicate your book to Norm Skillman.
Yep.
Everybody knows Skillman's store. Why?
My dad left home when I was 6, and Bemis was a marvelous place to grow up in. We had Dave Lawson and Norm Skillman and Jim Lindblom and Dr. Kellogg and a number of people who lived in the village who took it on themselves to look after people like myself and make sure they came up right. And Norm was one of the best.
And came up right you did. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for sharing the latest book, The Last Raft, Timbering in Chautauqua's Virgin Watershed. It really is a powerful book and so much information in it. So thank you, Ned Ward.
Thank you very much, and I'll just leave you with this. There's one on the computer now on early Chautauqua aviators. And when I got into it, I got into it because A.J. Engel ran a mail service on Chautauqua Lake, picked up the mail in Jamestown, took it up to Celeron, flew it from Celeron to Bemis and Chautauqua, and then on up to Mayville in 1916, and that's what, 03 were the Wright brothers, so it's 13 years after the Wright brothers, and here we were in little Chautauqua County having that kind of experience. But as I researched, Amelia Earhart landed on the 14th fairway at Chautauqua. Charles Lindbergh flew over. Galbraith, trying to think of his last name, Rogers, did the first transcontinental flight that came right through Jamestown and Lakewood. There were probably 24 early aviators that made significant contributions to aeronautics that either came from here or flew through here. And if any of you know of any that you remember, I'd love to hear about them.
All right, you're going to have a guaranteed spot here when that book becomes reality, but I have, in order to assure it,
Okay.
I'm going to have a quiz for you, and I'll give you the question, because we don't have the answer. The airport is titled JHW, named after John H. Wright. John H. Wright was very close friends with Robert H. Jackson.
Yes, he was.
We have never found, given their relationships, in fact, I have some audio of John Wright, found out what H stands for. Because everything you see is John Wright, except the airport is JHW. So the Jackson scholars, because of the relationship, we've been asking that of everybody. So when you come here next year,
It wasn't Huguenot.
or Howard or anything like that. So your job is to figure out if that was real or somebody just plugged it in to get 3 letters. And by the way, just so everybody knows, it's the it's the Chautauqua County Airport, but it's the Robert H. Jackson Field. Story to follow. Teaser. Thank you. This is fantastic.
You are welcome.
This is
You're
great.
welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.
It was great. Thank you.
It has been dredged recently, parts of it, but the real dredging took place during the lumbering era, because when the pine began to play out, they needed, by that time they had more sophisticated equipment. They could cut hardwoods easier, so they would ring floats of hardwood boards with pine, and they would send them down either as boards or logs down the river, and it wouldn't always work, and those logs would go to the bottom. And once the logs started accumulating, it would slow the path of the water down, and the silt would precipitate out from it and began to fill up the river. So in right just before 1900, the Eastern States Dredging Company was hired to dredge 2.5 miles of the outlet, or what they said was 2.5 miles at the time, and they took 180,000 cubic yards of silt out of the outlet and dumped it in Burtis Bay. So there's consequences for what we do. May not know them right away,